with fathers that I'm aware of doesn't tend to tell us a great deal about what these fathers are actually doing. So a key theme for me was to find out a little bit more about those things. I have particular interest in embodied masculinities. I like to put that in because I like to say I like to have an interest in men's bodies. But I think it's really interesting to see how men's bodies, the values that are attached to men's bodies, change as they move through particular spaces and places, how they intersect with things like age. And it brings a whole range of different complex ways of looking at masculinity to the surface. I also teach part-time at Hope. I have been here for a few years. I move around according to where I'm needed at the moment. I'm in social policy over the road, where I'm on a .6 at the moment with Laura Penketh and a few of the other members of the teaching staff, I'm sure that you all know. So most previous research with fathers who have autistic children, for me, is problematic. It tends to homogenise fathers. So the fathers that have been included in the research, they've not been addressed in terms of the complexity of the different spaces and identities that fathers can have. They assume that autism is a bad and burdensome thing, and it assumes that fathers can't cope. I think partly that is because this research is very much driven by a medical model, okay? There's a focus on white middle-class employed men and typical families. And because of that, the experiences of dads that don't parent in those very kind of typical ways are ignored. And there's a whole range of different experiences and different people parenting, different approaches to parenting, different awareness of parental roles, different relationships that have been kind of eclipsed in research. And one of the things that is also really important to me is that when we think about autistic children are also classed, they're gendered, they're raced, and that again is something that's being ignored in research. And we've seen a real homogenisation of autism and of dads, okay? So that really is my starting point. Because there has been an over-focus on white middle-class employed men, what has tended to come out of the research, even of kind of the very, what I would call the most recent, the least oppressive research around men, tends to focus on what you would call new fatherhood. So you have dads that go to work through the day, come home of an evening and talk about how lovely it is to have a cuddle with the kids and put them to bed at the end of the day. Well, there's nothing really very new about that. So really, the research, as much as it's trying to push some of the boundaries and challenge some of the ideas around disability and masculinity, doesn't really do that, because it tends to, more than anything, reinforce those quite normal ideas about families and family life. So we don't really know a great deal about fathers and autistic children and how they interact. There's a lot of focus on services, which I think is a good thing, because obviously there are issues with services, particularly around gendered involvement in services and the way that services interact with families. But the over-focus on services tends to dehumanise people with autism, because when we only focus on those things in research, we tend to ignore the fact that autistic people do lead ordinary daily lives, and that also is something that needs to be addressed through research, and how dads and people with autism interact in ordinary, daily, mundane contexts. Okay? If there's any questions at any point, please just give me a shout. So moving on to methodological and theoretical problems. So the fatherhood research generally, not just in terms of looking at the intersection of fatherhood, masculinity and disability, tends to continue to reflect culturally specific conceptualisations of fathering. So what I mean when I talk about those ideas is that when we think of fathers, and traditionally the things that fathers do, that might be things like playing with the kids, okay? And when research only reflects those things, I'm sure there are huge numbers of dads that are engaged in lots of other activities with the kids outside of just those things. Having said that, there are cultural and kind of ideological barriers placed on dads in terms of what they're able to do and the ideas that we have about the roles that dads play. But because that's not been really addressed in any great depth in the literature or in the research with fathers who have children with the label of autism, the way that dads have been presented or the things that dads do has reflected those quite dominant ideas. So what you are seeing is representation of dads that say, okay, well, I've been to work and I'm going to come out and play with the kids, or I'm going to take them swimming, or whatever it is that people do. And that's lovely. That's great for those dads that do those things, but there are lots of dads, in my opinion, that are doing lots of other things, and those aspects of people's lives tend to be obscured by this very dominant model of what is a good dad. There's a real issue with gender reductionism and ideas around hegemonic masculinity. So a lot of research still concludes that dads or masculinity has some kind of incompatibility with disability. So it's something that men can't cope with, that it's something that they need to walk away from, and that there are these very kind of medical ideas that it's something that's innate in men, that it's something that they cannot cope with. And again, these are ideas that I think are quite dominant in research, and what I'm really trying to do is unpick some of that, as well as thinking about how it affects what dads do, also about how it affects how dads think and conceive of themselves in terms of interacting with the kids and in their wider relationships. But having said all that, bearing in mind I'm trying to challenge a lot of the ideas, stereotypes around masculinity, I think it's important as well to say that the responsibility for disabled children does tend to rest very much with mothers. But I'm hoping that through exploring masculinity in relation to disability, we can begin to open those conversations up in order to challenge the position that women are put in with regard to disability. Okay? So moving on. Dads, generally, that might be a bit too broad a definition, in research are seen as a problem, okay? They're seen as threatening, not really very committed, unskilled, irrelevant. At the worst, they're considered toxic, paedophiles, sexually dangerous. At the best, they're just considered basically bumbling idiots, okay? And these are stereotypes, these are very dominant stereotypes. But because of these stereotypes, dads' contributions to parenting are ignored, or they're seen as less weighty than the contributions that mothers make. They're seen as maybe a little bit incompetent, in need of guidance, they need some kind of training, they need to be shown what to do. And all of these messages reinforce gender stereotypes. They reinforce the ideas we have about what men should do, what women should do, what fathers would do, what mothers should do. And these are harmful for everybody. They're harmful for mothers, for fathers, and for kids, and they're harmful to society more broadly. Having said that, because of those stereotypes, fathers' relationships with children are very tightly governed. So they're policed in relation to children, maybe in ways that women aren't. And they have implications for people's relationships with their children, mothers' and fathers' relationships with their children. And obviously this has implications for everybody. So to address some of this, for me, is a feminist issue. Working from a feminist paradigm, it means that in order to advance some kind of gender equality in parenting, we need to look at what men do, or men's role in parenting, in the same way that we look at what women do. And yet, absolutely, some of these stereotypes give men the option to opt out of parenting, or to say, well, you know, this isn't my job, this is somebody else's job, it's not right that I should do this, that I am a dad, it's not a man's role. But on the other hand, the stereotypes also hold back men that might be more progressive, might want to engage with the kids in a different way, and therefore they're not helpful to anybody, basically. So those slides really that was quite wordy, at the background to my research. This is the position I came from when I was going out to recruit in order to take some of these ideas forwards. So I've got a lot of methodological concerns, so I've got another slide about them here. So the norms and the stereotypes that I've spoken about influence research. They influence research agendas. They give particular people the power to define people's lives, to define particular groups in society. They influence policy, they influence practice, okay? And fathers, because of these things, the influence of these ideas, they also obviously permeate through to fathers and to mothers. So fathers may feel more obliged, particularly in a research context, to only express the very acceptable, dominant cultural aspects of fatherhood that they are expected to display. So fathers that are doing or performing different aspects of fatherhood, different aspects of masculinity, might feel that they are not able to bring these things forward because they may think that the expectations that society places on them means that they should hide them, they should not discuss them, they should not express these particular views or ideas. And if we think about emotion, the fit of emotion is strongly connected to gender. And because of the combination of these things, we need to recognise that the discussions that we have about how men are, particularly the discussions or the way that men's emotions in relation to disabled children or autistic children or whatever label we want to use, have been represented in literature. Some of these ideas about how men should behave have influenced the way that people behave in an interview situation and have influenced research agendas. Okay? And because of those things, we need to be really sensitive, for me, on how I work with men in order to get past some of these very preliminary but very dominant ideas, and to be sensitive to the fact that some of these men will feel very, very vulnerable, will feel very pigeonholed, and are very aware of the fact that people are going to look to want to find criticism in the way that they parent their kids and the way that they behave as men. And there are a real narrow range of kind of acceptable, valid ways to be a man. So to challenge some of those ideas, again, means that there aren't always the identity, the valid identity positions that men can draw on in order to say, this is what I'm like as a dad, these are the practices that I do, this is how I feel about my parenting, this is how I feel about my kids. Because masculinity is quite a narrow little box, stepping out of what it means to be a man in relation to a disabled child, carry penalties for men. And this is again something that needs to be worked into, for me, my methodology, in order to get the data that I really wanted to obtain. Any questions so far? Shall I move on? Ella, will you tell me when I've talked for too long, because I'll just go on for hours.
We're all interested.
Okay. So my methodology, I think it's quite contentious to some people, but not to me, because for me it fits with what it was I wanted to know. I'm sure most of you will be aware of Stallion Wise, feminist academics, yeah? Very well known. One of the main points, and one of the main points of feminist research, is that the ontologies of the oppressed rest on forbidden emotions and forbidden thoughts. And I really, really, really love that quote. And I think, if you think about some of the things I've just said about men in relation to disability, because of the very socially prescribed role that men are expected to fit into, some of the things that they do or want to do or think or don't think or say or don't say are affected or are perhaps forbidden. Okay, they are forbidden from expressing them in a professional or a private context. And because those ideals, those thoughts are forbidden, they're quite difficult to get at. Whether or not you can argue that a man is oppressed is something that I think most people find difficult. But for me, I think when you're looking at parenting, the particular dads that I've looked at and that I've worked with, I do feel in many ways they are oppressed in terms of the way that they would like to parent their children, and the way that they are allowed to feel and discuss and reflect on their parenting. Okay? Whether or not people think that that's something that's generally a bit difficult to think about men being oppressed, it's something for me that is quite a powerful thing. I don't think people are oppressed in all contexts, but certainly as we move through this presentation, I think it will come clear how gender oppression functions in men's lives as well as in women's. So, like I said before, my aim is to develop a research approach that acknowledges this aspect of fathers' lives and recognise that men's bodily presence, practices, performances and discourses in many ways in relation to autistic children are forbidden. Okay? And I wasn't looking to produce generalisable accounts. I wanted to look at the complexity of people's lives. I wanted to look at these rich subjective experiences, and I wanted to look at how men's experiences of parenting children changed according to the context, according to the age of the child, the gender of the child, the relationships that they were engaged in, the people that were present in any kind of given situation, and just looking at things from these very complex, different perspectives, brought up such a range of different things. My work is underpinned by intersectionality, contemporary masculinities and gender theory, and something that quite recently has come to me is stuff particularly around Gibbons. I'm a fan of Gibbons because I'm not, but I am particularly interested in ontological fear and insecurity, because I think one of the things that's come across very strongly for me has been around men not being sure of what their identity is, not having any kind of clear narrative or frame to fall back on in order to kind of embed their parenting in. And that makes it difficult for them. It makes them feel vulnerable, it makes them feel insecure, and for a whole range of reasons I think it's something that's a useful way to theorise around men, particularly in relation to disabled children. The methods that I used with the dads that I worked with were very much around narrative interviews. Some of the dads, I did a very similar study for my masters, which I did here at Hope. I did a masters in social work, but on a much smaller scale. And the dads that I worked with, some of them I've now worked with for kind of 5 and 6 years, so I've got almost a relationship with them, a professional relationship. But we have we reflect on each other's lives. I don't interview in a kind of formal way, and something that was quite difficult for some of the dads to get used to get their heads around, that I wasn't going to turn up with a list of questions or a questionnaire or anything like that, and it was going to be a conversation, and it was also two-way traffic. So when I was talking to the dads and engaging them in conversation, they would also engage me in conversation, and we learned loads and loads of different things from one another. Some of the dads I've interviewed 5-6 times. I've been able to go back again and again and again and again. We've also used photo elicitation, one of the things that I found really useful, particularly to get a conversation going with dads who are expecting me to criticise them, I think a lot of the time, is to begin with photos on people's mobile phones. So I'll say, can you tell me about your kids? Show me some pictures of your kids, let's see what you've been doing. And people go through their phones and they will have all kinds of things that they've forgotten about. Oh, this is the day when we went here, or we did, oh, I've forgotten I did that. And it's just a real interesting way to open discussions up. And quite often with the photo elicitation, one of the dads might bring up one photograph, and from that one photograph we would talk for 2 hours, because it is just a link to all kinds of different things. And when I talk about the visual stuff, I'm not interested in deconstructing the visual. It's just a tool in order to get people opening up and thinking and discussing and reflecting on lives. And we've also used object elicitation. Some of the dads have brought things that the children enjoy playing with, or things that they use together, all kinds of different things. And again, that's a really good way to get people to discuss things, to think outside the box, really, to think about ordinary daily life and not to focus on clinic appointments and DLA forms and special schools, because it would be very easy for conversations to go down that route, and that was something that I really didn't want to focus on. Now my sample worked with 10 dads. Most of the dads that I've worked with identify as full-time carers. Very few of them work outside the home. So one of the things I really wanted to do was to break down or to address the dominance of the male provider and the mum at home that has been so dominant in research, and to work with dads that don't fit with that particular kind of mould of fatherhood. So I've been really lucky in engaging with dads that don't really go to work. I think out of my sample, I think I've got 2 that work. Most of them are full-time carers. Some of them are married, some of them are separated. 2 of them are single dads with full-time custody. One separated with significant contact with and responsibility for his daughter. And we all have at least one son or daughter with the label of autism. Another thing that's been really interesting for me is because autism tends to be associated with men and boys, to get women with autism and girls with autism in the sample has brought up all kinds of really interesting data in the way that men relate, or fathers relate, to women or girls with autism, and how the gender of the child is really important in considering the relationship between fathers and children. So it's not just about men and in relation to disability, it's men in relation to disability in relation to gender. So it tends to get really quite complicated. And the way that men relate to male children and female children, and the way that that's policed by society, is a really quite a striking thing that's come up as part of the research. Have I been talking for ages? No. Okay. So because of I use a narrative approach, and because I try to build up a relationship, a long-term relationship with the people that I work with, it's been important that I recognise that I'm part of what it is that I try to understand, and that my own life history informs my approach to research. I have a son with autism, and I've divulged that to people that I've worked with. I still have some ethical difficulty with it, because I know that as much as I am bound by confidentiality in terms of other people's data, the people that I disclose that to aren't bound in the same way. And there are issues for me there in terms of, am I exploiting my child? Am I using him in order to get better data? For me, it's been ethically difficult to work with some of those issues. But I think as part of acknowledging how vulnerable I've felt in doing that, it's helped me to focus on how vulnerable the dads feel in taking part in the research. So there's been a bit of shared concerns there. Some of my other vulnerabilities are around breaching the responsibilities expected of a mum who has a disabled child. And in discussing that with the dads in a research situation, that has encouraged them to discuss their own vulnerabilities about the positions that they feel they are expected to occupy. And through sharing these kind of discussions backwards and forwards between each other, we've been able to kind of co-construct particular meanings or challenge each other in terms of what society expects us to do. They can challenge me on my assumptions about them. I can challenge them about, our assumptions about each other. And it's been a real dynamic and interesting way of working. Not all the dads have been comfortable with it. And I have not been comfortable with all the dads. And I'm not sure why. But I just know that with some of them, it's been a really good method. It's worked really, really well. But there has to be some kind of trust and mutuality there. And it's not something that I get from everyone. And I do tend to work from my gut a lot of the time. So if I get a feeling that something is going to go well and I'm comfortable enough to disclose something to somebody, I get the feeling that they will do that in return to me, and we are able to negotiate a kind of a research relationship, and that has worked well, in particular with the dads that were kind of open to working in that way. But anyway, because I was able to work in this way, or because I was the dads that were able to engage with me in that way, I hope that would make the research very transparent. I think there's a real fear for dads in that they are going to be labelled as inferior. That was some kind of spy that was looking to criticise and say, oh, these dads, they do this and this, but really, loads of crap, and this is what they're doing. And that was not being my agenda at all. Obviously, if their dads are having difficulties with parenting, or have oppressive attitudes towards whatever their oppression is, I can't ignore that, because that's going to come up in my research. That's something that I will need to address. But that has not been my specific focus. My specific focus was not to go out and try and catch people out. And I think to some degree, I think this is part of the problem, in that it can be quite difficult to recruit dads to studies like this. Dads expect to be criticised. Sometimes that criticism is, that's okay. But by and large, most of the dads that I've worked with, they've been brilliant. They've been great, and I've really enjoyed it. Having said that, one of the key approaches for me was explaining to dads that this is how most dads have been framed in the past. This is what most researchers sought to do. This is what a lot of researchers sought to do. And this is my particular position on the topic, and this is where I'm coming from, so that we could at least come into it, or at least have some shared understanding of what it was that I was trying to achieve through engaging them in the research process. No. I'm going to move on to one particular case story that I'm going to use today just to illustrate some of the points that I've discussed. This is one particular dad that I've worked with quite intensively. These are obviously not real names, but this dad's called Dominic, and he has 2 children with autism, a son and a daughter, 2 teenage children. He's separated from his wife, and he's given up paid employment, so he's a full-time carer. And he has custody during the week of his daughter. She goes to see mum at the weekend, and his son attends a residential school Monday to Friday and comes home to him at the weekend. Mum has very, very little contact with the son. Both children labelled with autism at a very, very early age. Okay, just a couple of quotes from Dominic about the kids. First, in relation to his son, Daniel. Daniel's a bundle of joy, he really is. He's so happy in himself. He's got something about him, he's got a vibration about him. And when you're in it with him, you can't help but feel happy, because he brings you in and he's always happy, he's always laughing. And he's funny, he's got his own sense of humour, he's very quirky with his humour, and he's easy to be with. And about Rebecca, she'd be looking over at me, waiting for me to say, do you want to go for a little walk? It's almost like if I didn't do that, she'd know that something wasn't right. Something was wrong, and it would. She can sense my moods. Okay? So what I hope you get from that is that the way that Dominic constructs his children, the way that he reflects on his children, he to some extent challenges some of the stereotypical ideas about autism just through those statements. Okay? Dominic thinks of his children as active agents. He does not talk about the kids as a problem. through his discussion, particularly about his daughter, looking back at him and asking, you know, she would know that if he didn't take her for a walk, that he would not be right. She can feel his moods. He challenges all those ideas about autistic children not being conscious, about not having the ability to form relationships with people. There's a mutuality to them. He talked about his kids. Obviously he said a lot more than that, but he talked about the things that they like doing. He talks about their love for him, their love for each other. He talks about their relationships. They are complex human beings. They are not the problems, the two-dimensional problems that fit the dominant ideas and stereotypes that we have about autistic children. And Dominic does not fit the stereotypes that we have about fathers in relation to autistic children. Although to some degree, those very first statements fit with quite dominant ideas about what it is appropriate for a dad to do. Through those statements about going out and being with his children, or going on walks with his kids, or having fun with his kids, when he expresses those emotions, the emotions that he talks about, they are quite hegemonically masculine. So there's nothing very different about those particular statements that any other dad might not say about their kids, which is a good thing. Having said that, they're not that deep either. Now, this particular dad is a great dad. I think he's a marvellous dad, and I've spent a lot of time with him. But I think it's important to recognise that if the interview had stopped there, that had been the end of my involvement with this particular dad. We wouldn't really have extended our knowledge about fathers in relation to autism a great deal, other than this dad's happy, and as far as he's concerned, the kids are happy. And it was the methodology really, in using a narrative method, and the way that Dominic is implotted in the stories that he continues to tell over the interviews that have been carried out subsequently, that allowed me to move beyond those really quite narrow and stereotypical ideas. So other fears that come up, other feelings that come up for Dominic, particularly are in relation to fear and powerlessness, which is what brings me back a little bit now to some of the ideas I've had recently around Giddens and ontological insecurity. Dominic's fears are about being framed as an unfit father. And these stories come out because they percolate under the surface of the big story that he tells around being with his kids and having fun with his kids. There are judgments made about him based upon his emotional expressions. So if he does not fit with what is expected of him in terms of norms of masculinity, then there are real consequences for him in terms of how he is judged as a parent. Particularly in relation to autism, into the age and the gender of the kids, if he breaches those norms too much, it becomes a risk. There are potentially consequences for him. Okay? And Dominic is quite powerless when it comes to formal services and organisations, particularly those that are the police parents. Some of the ideas that we have about fathers being less competent and needing to be kind of policed and trained are quite dominant. And the ideas of hegemonic masculinity and the way that he needs to behave in order to meet with those norms are quite embedded in the perspectives of those services. The emotions that he feels, that he expresses, have repercussions for him. He needs to present as coping at all times, or his parenting is judged. And when I say coping, I don't mean that he has to perform. I don't mean that he's not allowed to not be coping. When I talk about coping, one of the things that's really struck me about Dominic is, on one occasion he's discussed his feelings about his son going back to school during the week. And Dominic hates saying goodbye to his son on a Monday morning when he goes back to school, and it makes him really upset. And one particular day he was telling me this particular story, that he was trying to come to terms with the fact that his son had gone back to this residential school, and he was feeling really sad and upset. And somebody from the family came in and saw him and said that he wasn't coping, he was depressed, he needed to see a psychiatrist, he needs some kind of emotional support. And then that kind of gets fed back to children's services and other agencies around the child and around the family. And if he does not cope, if he is seen to not be strong, then he is labelled as a problem. Okay? So as much as Dominic has emotional pain, his emotional pain, the expression of emotional pain, can influence how he is judged as a parent. Now, personally, and I'm sure the rest of you would agree with me, if Dominic is sad because his kid's gone back to residential school, he should be allowed to express that sadness. That's a healthy thing. But because he's a man, he's not allowed to do that. And if he does it, his parenting is questioned and he is seen as less competent as a parent. Now, I don't know if the boot was on the other foot, if the experience would be the same for a mum. I don't know. But male caregiving is still judged according to gender stereotypes, and any kind of deferment from that is interpreted, particularly by professionals, as an inability to cope, which has real repercussions for him. Which brings me on to ideas around toxic masculinity and ideas about how men should behave and how, if men differ from this model of acceptable masculinity, how ideas about men as harmful are also problems for Dominic. So toxic masculinity, for anyone that's not aware of the concept, is the constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia and wanton violence. But toxic masculinity creates stereotypes around men. It's a powerful, powerful ideological barrier which creates gender divides in care and family relationships. And these ideas around toxic masculinity are ideas that men need to, or dads need to negotiate around their practical involvement with children. And because of these ideas about toxic masculinity, they leak also into the interview situation. So again, this is something that men might not even discuss because they're very, very aware of it all the time. And again, this was something that I needed to address and be aware of. These factors can prevent the emergence of men's narratives about their participation, particularly around intimate care. So if you've got a man like Dominic that is a carer on his own with no female partner, if he's got a teenage daughter with significant care needs, how does he negotiate his involvement in intimate care, and how is that policed? And this is something that it's quite difficult to engage dads in discussion about because they're so afraid of being labelled perverts. And if I've been quite cheeky, because I will raise it with dads and I will discuss it and say, you know, do you bath your child? Do you know, whatever? How do you have to put the kids in the shower? However I would phrase the conversation, I might draw on my husband doing those things as a way to introduce it into the conversation. If I do that, it opens the discussion up, men feel less threatened, and then they will start to come out, particularly with all kinds, about how they feel regulated by society, and people think it's something that they shouldn't be doing, and yet it's the most unhealthy way to regulate a relationship between a father and a child and say you cannot be involved in caring for your child in this way. I find it very, very sad. But for this particular dad, for Dominic, and I think for a lot of the dads that I've worked with, it's a real issue. I don't know if any of you have read any work by Jackie Garb. She does a lot of work around fathers and intimacy, and she's looked at it in terms of dads with non-disabled children. But when you're looking at disabled children, when you're looking at children that might not speak with words, when you're looking at disabled teenage girls, it becomes even more magnified. And those ideas about men being toxic are really, really problematic, and they prevent men or they create barriers for men in terms of them wanting to do things or wanting to engage in particular things with the kids, but society tells them that they can't. And that can be things in public and things in private as well. So I'll come back to Dominic in a minute, but I'm just thinking of another dad that I interviewed recently, who he was with his daughter in a supermarket. He took her into the disabled toilet because she needed to use the toilet, and when he came out, the security guards were waiting for him. So it's things like that that we take for granted, as I think particularly for me as a woman, that create real barriers and real issues for men, and perhaps explain why why some men are have difficulty in terms of some parenting practices, and it's not because they don't want to do them, it's because of the way that society, the ideas that society has around men, particularly in relation to maybe vulnerable young women, vulnerable girls, that only ever views the male gaze or male bodily presence as kind of harmful and toxic. But anyway, back to old Dominic. What happened to Dominic was that his family members suggested that he should no longer be involved in bathing his teenage daughter. Okay? If he does not bath his teenage daughter, she needs to get in the bath, just like we all need to get in the bath. If he doesn't bath his teenage daughter, then support workers will have to come out and bath his teenage daughter, because there's nobody else to do it. Why? I just find the whole thing such a horrible thing to have to think through. She has a relationship with him. She loves him. He's her dad. She wants him to care for her. He wants to care for her. But society is saying, oh no, this is inappropriate. You can't do this. You can't do it because you're a man. Well, we can get a stranger in to come and do it. And how would that child feel to have that particular experience? To say that, well, no, we can't let your dad do this anymore, but you know, we can let somebody else do it. But I think particular for the way that men theorised, how Dominic theorised around what was going on, how uncomfortable this made him feel. There's no stable identity concept for him to draw on. There's no other way. There's no way. The ideas around men being perverts, for want of a better word, are so dominant. There's no other way he can theorise or he can justify his participation. It's very, very difficult to him to find a way to frame his parenting, because it's so outside of the norm of the way that men are kind of expected to parent, and the way that men have relationships with teenage children, teenage female bodies and caring for them. What he tends to do, and what some of the other dads do, is because he can't reframe himself, he will reframe his daughter. So he will talk about her own innocence and how she's childlike, as a way to reframe and take any kind of tension out of the situation, to manage the uncomfortable feelings. Because for him, there's so much uncertainty around his role, he can't reframe himself, so he has to reframe her as well, instead, as an alternative, to take the kind of uncertainty and the vulnerability out of the situation, which I find really quite sad. But particularly working with some of the dads around intimate care, around how they understand, or how other people understand the role, as being perhaps to date the most enlightening and the richest parts of the research. Because to focus just on the ideas around new fatherhood and the dad that goes to work and comes out and plays with the kids, it misses out all of this other very rich data, the ideas that we have around the way that men should behave in relation to children. And it brings up so much interesting stuff. So just to summarise, men are overwhelmed, or most of the men that I've worked with are overwhelmed by anxiety. They question their place in the world, their role in relation to children. They're not clear about what they are and they are allowed to do. Working with these feelings, with their anxiety, as well as my own anxiety, leads to richer research. Okay, personally, that is my particular conclusion. The current gender regime does create difficulties for men who want to engage with their children beyond the merely tokenistic. What has been represented in research generally is tokenistic. I don't think we've really scratched the surface in terms of the way that men want to engage with the kids and the way that men are engaging with the kids, and how that is kind of policed in lots of different ways. Learning the boundaries of gender causes personal insecurity for men, and there are consequences for them in terms of not just the validity of their masculinity, but about their capability and competence as fathers. Okay? And just to conclude, a more sophisticated theorisation of the emotional lives of fathers. We have to assume that there is, well, I think you will all know, there is nothing innate in a man that makes him emotionally incapable. There is nothing innate in a man that makes him not able to engage with children. And we can't assume that what has been represented regarding fathers with autistic children is not because men have issues with autism, because I really don't think that they do. I think they have issues with how society dictates how they should behave. What I hope that my PhD eventually, when I get to the end of it, because this is obviously just a very, very small part of a discussion with one particular dad, will disrupt that incongruence between masculinity and disability. That is what I really hope that I will achieve. I think that we will. The men that I've worked with are proud of their children. They're not miserable. The interviews are filled with laughter. I laugh, the dads laugh, we have all kinds of anecdotes. They're not depressed, they're not having a terrible time, but they are having a terrible time because they are governed in terms of their gender. So I would say for men who've got children with autism, to sum up, they don't have issues with autism. They have issues with the way their gender positions them in relation to autism and in relation to their children.